This week, we had Zohar of One Creation on the podcast to talk about a very well-designed privacy solution leveraging encryption, including homomorphic encryption, for organizations. Zohar has a wealth of knowledge on privacy and encryption and has a strong grasp on the needs and demands of his target clients, and he clearly brings that vision to One Creation solutions. Hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Encrypted Economy, a weekly podcast featuring discussions exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel. I've spent decades representing regulated exchanges, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and all manner of fintech companies for all things touching electronic trading with a focus on new and developing technologies. So, really excited to have Zohar, CEO of One Creation, on the podcast today. One Creation helps organizations overcome the sovereignty and governance barriers that impact data collection and distribution through embedded privacy. Zohar, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excellent. So we'll start off like we usually do. Tell us a bit about yourself and your journey to One Creation.
Sure. I'm going to try and keep it brief because I'm maybe too old, or I increased the average age on your podcast. But basically,
join the club.
I've been in several startups before, but also worked at large organizations such as IBM and others. I was at a company that was acquired by the Intercontinental Exchange in 2014, and then was part of the team that acquired Interactive Data Corporation in 2015. Which created ICE Data Services. And I was happy to serve as the head of sales for that for several years. That meant that I sold a lot of data to a lot of different people, several billions worth of. And at that time, we would send auditors down to our clients to basically see if they're misusing our data. And we were, it wasn't a really pleasant experience, neither for the client or for us. So always in my mind, I was thinking about how can I control the usage of my client's data remotely. Then on a personal level, my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 11 years old. And for some reason, we started getting a huge amount of advertising from the medical device companies and so forth. And that really bothered me. So I started mapping how's that data coming on my son, realized that there was a company that collects a lot of prescriptions and is able to infer sales from those inscriptions. So the privacy concerns were elevated as a father. And I then joined a company called Digital Asset Holdings and got introduced to distributed ledgers and to smart contracts technology and found out about DAML, or in this case, a smart contract technology that will enable the granular creation of embedded privacy. And taking that technology together with some encryption knowledge that I had. I'm an ex-Israeli intelligence guy, and met a few very interesting people in the encryption space and in the security space. And by joining smart contracts with encryption, we were able to create the technology that One Creation has developed so far.
Excellent. So One Creation is primarily focused on the institutional side, selling the product to institutions. When you're talking to these institutional adopter of privacy solutions, like yours in particular, what are they telling you? Like, what has changed in the last year, in the last few years? What's the evolution path, and what do they really care about today?
Mm-hmm. Well, for years, and as part of the new digital era that we're entering right now, there's been a notion that it's okay to give up some of your privacy rights in order to get a better service. And that's really the definition of a social dilemma. When you come to the institutional perspective, the main problem that they have is how do we get better business insights that are directly from our firsthand data from clients, and then reshare that data with either internal departments or external partners in order to deduce better business insights and to be able to offer you better services as a client. Companies that will be able to do that well will win the digital era because they'll have much better business insights. But it doesn't have to come at the expense of our privacy. And that's really what we've seen throughout the years, the past decade, where a customer believes that his privacy is maybe breached. There are two types of customers. There are privacy passive and privacy active. Privacy passive are people that know that their privacy is being violated, but they're not really interested in doing anything about it. And privacy active are people that are interested in doing something about it. That percolates in different places to up to the regulators, who then pass privacy regulations. And we've seen GDPR, we've now seen the new Digital Act, which really moves the regulatory curve towards companies providing their customers with self-sovereignty over their data. That's where the curve is going. In the United States, given our culture, it percolates from the bottom up rather than from the top down. So we've seen 5 different states also apply privacy regulations, which means that I do foresee a privacy bill of rights in the coming years. But even if it's not that, you're still, as an organization, dealing with 120 different privacy laws in 180 countries in the world. So from an operational perspective, as an institution, you're constantly dealing with regulations that make the preservation of the privacy on behalf of your client a huge overhead. And we believe that we can change the business model and provide a better way to do that.
So I'm going to double click on a couple of things a little bit more and try to get a little more granular. So obviously, the world's been through COVID, which has changed the way that we interact online. Mm-hmm. Right now, there's a war in Ukraine, which, due to the sanctions on Russia and maybe a greater concern about like Russian intermeddling and Russian hacking, and you've seen North Korea. I mean, none of this is actually a news story. It's just with regards to cybersecurity or data, but it's been sort of these factors are sort of culminating. When you talk to institutional accounts, people who care about this, what specifically are they saying? Like, that's different from what they would have said in December of last year or January of last year. What nuance? How is the dial turned, even ever so slightly? What nuance are you detecting?
Mm-hmm. Well, the nuances that are since the pandemic and since these events is all about exfiltration of data. You see, corporations unfortunately don't really connect the fact that you're signing a privacy notice with let's say helping preserve that privacy on your behalf. And that means that they have to preserve almost anything that you've signed, that you've said okay. That means that they have more and more data, and as they're migrating between remote work and also migrating between private clouds and public clouds, the data fragmentation becomes even larger. From files and structured data, everything becomes more fragmented. And as the organization's CISO or chief data officer, you're responsible for GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. And that role is becoming more and more difficult as we fragment both ourselves as individuals working in a corporation, and also the data is getting more and more fragmented.
Right. And then as we contemplate sort of the pressures of maintaining privacy and cybersecurity, and also the possible integration of encryption technologies, how does that, I guess, substantively change the role of the chief information security officer? How does that, is it now more required for them to think in terms of data encryption, start to assume some of that privacy concerns as a CISO if they don't have a CPO, chief privacy officer? Maybe give us a little bit of color how that's, the CISO's role is changing in light of these events and new emphasis on privacy and encryption and the availability of encryption technologies.
I would say that there's 2 types of increased demand on the CISO in the organization. Number one is the fact that the regulation is becoming a lot more granular. Meaning, I want you to control data in a much more granular manner. And that really translates to many different things. Think about, instead of RBAC or instead of role-based access, you might need to have ABAC, attribute-based access. Instead of just authenticating, you want to apply authorization type, really. Rather than auth-N, you would want to apply auth-Z. And auth-Z not just on the API level, which is how current companies do auth-Z, meaning I approve that this is Eric, coming in to this API, or this is what he can get from this API, but really being able to protect data on and do authorization on the granular data level, which changes, the ways that current authorization and enforcement privacy policies are done. So it needs to be, number one, a lot more granular. Number two, it needs to move from just access to authorization, meaning what is the policy under which this data could be consumed? Because privacy policies change, and there are multiple, just in the United States, there are 50 different privacy policies in different states. And therefore, you have a massive dynamic problem on your hand. As the regulations change, it becomes more granular. You really need to start controlling your data in a much more granular manner. And that means that also the sensitivity of the data becomes more granular, which means that it moves towards more privacy-enhancing technologies. And most importantly, as those technologies get developed, you want more flexibility in terms of how to apply those technologies in your ever-changing architecture.
Right. And certainly even in Europe now, when you start to talk about algorithmic management of data, even in an encrypted format, we had Claudio Malgeri on the podcast talking about European regulation around that. It certainly complicates it even more, because now you're not just talking about data, but you're actually talking about potentially the algorithms that manage that data.
Yeah, absolutely. And the responsibility is becoming for you as the CISO of the organization to be the data trust. You're really becoming a data trust or a custodian, if you like to say, on behalf of your clients. This is at least the perception that this is already your data and you're therefore less liable because somebody pressed the privacy notice is gone. Meaning the privacy notice is really the source of mistrust and also the source of a lot of operational mess, because there's no way to granularly understand what is Eric has already consented to do, and therefore how do we apply those consents automatically to all the data sets and all the departments that we have. So one thing that we continue saying to CISOs is the problem doesn't necessarily start from where you are. It actually starts from all the way for how you collect your data from your customers, and that will need to change.
Right. And let's move a bit towards the authorization, sort of the consumer level authorization. We covered with Dylan Dudney recently decentralized IDs in the form of NFT. The notion, a Web3 notion, going back to that term, a Web3 notion of you bring your data with you. You bring your identity with you when you move across Web3 applications. But at a company level, they're not necessarily thinking about this. They're possibly thinking, where we have the data, how do we manage it? Or do you see those two worlds sort of coalescing more?
Well, I think the two worlds need to coalesce more and should coalesce more. And there is technology to allow that to coalesce more, meaning there is a direct relationship between the capabilities that or the self-sovereignty that you're providing to your customers and the trust that they put in your brand. If you don't, then the trust is reduced. So what is happening right now? There is a philosophical thinking in many of the organizations that your data is theirs. And that means that even as they protect the data, they really protect the data as though it's theirs. And versus the Web 3.0 type of self-sovereign environment, you bring your data where it is. Where do you bring your data, and who gives you your data? Who allows you to maintain that data on your behalf and actually tags it as your data? Currently, not a lot of organizations are doing that. I believe that the Digital Act and other regulations are moving towards that. And forget about the act. It's really, as you said, the technology itself is moving toward self-sovereignty. The problem is currently, at this stage, individuals and citizens and users don't have a power as it relates to control over their data. And that equation needs to change in order for corporations to adhere to the fast-moving technological and regulatory changes towards a Web 3.0 decentralized identity.
Excellent. So moving towards how you establish, the trust, because I think what we're saying here is like, the users, they have their decentralized ID, they bring their data, but ultimately, in order to engage with different environments, they may be consenting to share that data. So even though you have this sort of decentralized notion, unless the entities with which they engage say, we're not touching any of the data, right? We never touch the data. It stays with you. We just process it, but we don't do it. It all's done on your phone or your computer. That may not be realistic. It may take, not years, but decades to go that direction. And technologies may make those visions just hard to adapt, right? So ultimately, even in this notion of a Web3 world, you have a lot of cases where you still have to entrust. Perhaps those who participate with decentralized ID and bringing their data, take that trust more seriously, enter a creative, one creation type solution. And one of the things that one creation does is it focuses on this notion of establishing visual trust, because in order to process the additional trust, in order to establish that trust, it starts with the eyes. It starts with the interface. But I'm not going to talk your game. You tell us what is visual. How do you establish visual trust? What are the core elements of establishing?
That's a great question. So the answer to that question comes after a massive amount of research. There are many organizations that did a lot of research recently about privacy, our behaviors, who cares about it, and who doesn't. And the research has come up with 3 principles of establishing trust. So if you're a data custodian, you're a corporation, there are 3 ways that you can establish trust with your customers. Number 1 is clarity, and that's where the visual trust comes in. I need to see, at least at whatever level of granularity you are as the organization willing to offer me, I need to see where my data is being used. That visual trust establishes a certain comfort level. And how do you do that? We'll talk about in a second, meaning how do you establish that visual trust? But really, imagine a GPS on your data. I can see where in the organization, and both the organization and its partners, is my data being used, and for what purpose, and for how long. Those are the 3 things that people need to establish. Where is my data? Why are you using it? And for how long are you going to continue using it? We call it the 3 C's: clarity, control, and comfort. Comfort really comes in the notion of time. If you were able to self-destruct your data as the citizen remotely within the organization just by a click of a revoke button, then that establishes further trust. You feel comfortable and controlling of your data, although you're really not the owner of the data. It's really the corporation that's custodying your data for you. So those are the 3 C's. Now, how is it done? If you were treating what we do, our claim to fame or our patent is to take basically 2 technologies, smart contracts and homomorphic cryptography, and combine those in order to provide very granular rules around a data set. So we create an envelope, a digital rights envelope, similar to if you were using Outlook and you click on the Outlook and you could see that Outlook is going back to Azure information protection and trying to find out what's the policy where do you have the rights to do that? Imagine that on a very granular level and very, very fast for every data set. The result of that enforcement, anything connected to our digital rights enforcement mechanism, is a GPS, because you can visualize which department is actually using the data. And we've provided a lot of tools for the corporation to establish that trust granularly, because people might be a little, afraid when they start realizing what the corporation does with their data. Currently, ignorance is bliss. So it's quite an interesting, let's say, session in psychology, not just in technology.
Excellent. So yeah, I appreciate, particularly from a consumer level, to break it down in simplicity, because even from my own experience, I can tell you that sometimes I developed a cloud security management tool in a recently prior life. And even for people who do this every day, I was struck by it. This made sense to me, but man, you got to make it make sense to them.
Today's regulation, and GDPR especially, requires something called a DSR report. A DSR report is a data subject report, which is required under the regulation. So if you go to, any European institution, say, please tell me where my data is. The company should then generate a report to you. The report is usually in the form of a Word document that says to you, here's where we think your data is. But try to delete that data and they go we're not really sure if that data is really there. So there's a little bit, it's not enough, meaning GDPR rules and the DSR report is not enough to establish trust. people need real, live, visible, moving, things in order to say, yes, I feel a lot more secure that I know where my data is.
Right, because people don't want to spend the time parsing through a Word document, particularly if it was written by like bureaucrats or somebody who's, I mean, listen,
Exactly.
I'm not
all these disclaimers and yes, exactly.
Yeah, like it's so dense that you can't even make your way through it. So, moving on to the privacy enhancing stack of one creation, you talked about homomorphic encryption. What do you, first question, is it, what do you use for privacy enhancing technologies besides homomorphic encryption, just to, get the lay of the land?
Yeah. Well, I explained before that we have two types of technologies. First of all, the smart contracts themselves. The smart contracts are automated bots, basically. They work on a very simple notion that if you know who the parties are, what's their rights and what's their obligations, you can then assign, let's say, attribute level access to data sets. So imagine if you're a certain persona coming into your cloud environment, instead of using regular RBAC type of permissioning, you're now creating a fabric that sits in front of your cloud that goes back and says, okay, you're Eric. Eric is in this department, therefore he needs only to be able to see this part of the data set. The fabric then goes back to the data set, creates a data set just for Eric, and wraps it with a level of encryption. The level of encryption at that point could be either 0 or all the way to homomorphic cryptography. The reason that it could be 0 is because you're assigned a data set from the cloud, let's say it's a data lake, from the cloud that only you are authorized to see. So the fabric does authorization and provides you with that particular data set that's just wrapped with your signature on it. Even without the encryption or the privacy enhancing technologies, you're automatically getting attribute-based authorization on the data, which is very valuable without the encryption. Once you now decide, you know what, this data includes also sensitive data, or it's going to an outside vendor, and that's why we're calling ourselves embedded privacy. Depending on your workflow, you can then apply encryption to that particular workflow. It could start from no encryption, or it could start from an AES key. So a 256 AES key wrapped around the data, which means what we call first generation encryption, meaning the consumption on the other side will have to be done through a key that gets engulfed inside the wrapper. But if you open the data, we have no further control over the data, because you've opened it, you're now consuming it downstream without any encryption. If you decided that the downstream consumer, let's say it's a third party and it includes PII information, and you wanted the data is very, very sensitive. So what we will allow you to do is to wrap the data together with the policy, with the smart contract, and decide granularly inside that data set which data should be obfuscated using homomorphic cryptography. The data set will then remain in ciphertext. And you can then run, and by the way, it could be commingled, meaning imagine an Excel sheet that has 3 rows that are in ciphertext and 5 rows that are in plain text. You can do that with our API. So first of all, we can granularly select which data will be obfuscated through homomorphic cryptography. The second thing that we were able to do is to shrink the data dramatically and selectively only engulf it, because usually homomorphic cryptography increases the size of the data dramatically. And the most important piece is that now the data is engulfed with a privacy enhancing technology that's mobile, meaning you don't really need to go into a data room or a clean room and try to retrieve the data from the clean room. It's a mobile clean room. And that's how we use homomorphic cryptography. So if the data is going from, I don't know, Kroger to PepsiCo to be shared, and this is data on Eric, then I would assume that Kroger will encrypt Eric's data, for instance, age, as an example, using homomorphic cryptography. And if the PepsiCo algorithm, they're using whatever algorithm to run computation on the data, wants to know the average age of all the users in a file that is obfuscated, they will be able to still get the result of that data, even though it's still encrypted.
Right. And in PepsiCo's case, then I'm assuming that they would have to be they have to have the same backbone for
Yes,
the homomorphic
yes.
encryption. Like it's
So
not
that's a very important thing to note. If you put homomorphic cryptography, you're asking the other side to either connect to your own clean room, which is a lot of these companies that you mentioned in the beginning that you've interviewed so far do. That's their, connect this to one place and all applications go. Or you could use our technology, which allows PepsiCo to take it downstream. Now, if it takes it on their side and the data is still homomorphically encrypted, they need some sort of an API to run those computations. That means that they will have to download a one creation SDK or a plugin to your, depending on where the data will remain, to run those computations. So yes, it is a secure distribution and dissemination fabric, automatic and dynamic, but it does require, especially if you want downstream computation on encrypted data, it does require from the downstream client and partner to establish the backbone or to connect to the API that you've provided them.
right. And then through that API, what are the in terms of running the algorithms, could the algorithms be created independently by PepsiCo? Would they have to be integrated in with the API? Would they have to leverage One Creation's algorithms for managing that data?
So that's a fantastic question. It's a little bit involved. So let me explain first what you're asking. So if the data is encrypted, and imagine that I have a Jupyter Labs and I want to run, a very sophisticated regression on it, or I want to bring some data in. If the data is encrypted, that's not that easy, right? Because it's hard to run select functions on the data and so forth. So there are several ways to do this. Either we provide out of the box, the API provides basic computations, meaning add, subtract, divide, multiply, right?
Oh.
And
fully homomorphic.
Fully homomorphic.
Okay.
On fully homomorphic data. Now you could take those results and then compile them into almost any formula that you want. Take a mean, regression, or anything like that. It includes one of those basic computations. So we allow you, the organization, either to provide just the basic results and then provide those results to be computed on PepsiCo side, or you can then, through the API, run, for instance, I don't know, standard deviation if you want it as a formula, and that's a little bit more involved because it requires more resources. So it really depends on how you install the environment and what resources you have to run more or less complex computation on encrypted data. Any computation on encrypted data does require resources.
Yeah. So basically, and we're going to talk about the I guess the each of the levels. We kind of touched on it briefly. Zero encryption, all the way down to fully homomorphic encryption. It sounds like you also have partial homomorphic encryption as well, which is less computationally intense. You have 256 encryption.
Yep.
That's right. So those are the use cases, and I think we did touch on the various use cases, which really goes to the sensitivity of the data and
Exactly.
and the computational overload. We'll take a step back. We'll talk about PepsiCo, and we'll talk about in this case we'll call it the One Creation client. Who's managing that database and granting those accesses and running the whole thing from the One Creation client, and then who's managing it from PepsiCo generally? I know there's not one single answer.
Right. So remember, we actually have a workflow, and the workflow that I've discussed is that actually you are a Kroger's client, you're a supermarket client in their loyalty program, and Kroger is collecting data on you, then turning around and resharing that data both internally and with PepsiCo, for example. So what we've done is, because we're using smart contracts, it's really the authorization fabric is a self-sovereign fabric, meaning anyone can actually come in, and you could offer it also to your clients, to your other partners, and say, I am going to now take a data set, define where the data set is, and then set policies for who can see that data, either internally or externally. And if they do see that data internally or externally, at what encryption level are they able to see that? It could be done at any department level. It could be done at any business level. It's intuitive enough to be able to be setting up. So meaning, I want now to run a campaign and to ask Eric is the user of Kroger, okay, that I want to run a campaign and tell him, Eric, listen, we're running a new campaign that says that every time you go to a restaurant twice, we're going to take off 20% of the second bill, but you have to be there in person. This is not an order online. Now, think about that scenario. I have to collect geotagging data from Eric. I have to collect credit card information that I might have or might not have on Eric. And with the combination of those two, I can deduce the business insights that Eric went to Applebee's twice last week and automatically then deduct 20% using that service. But Eric needs to opt in to saying, I will share this data for a period of time. Well, that's interesting because it's very sensitive data. And now Eric wants to, and now Kroger wants to share the fact that they have geotagging on data with PepsiCo, which wants to know which restaurant does Eric visit, because is it a PepsiCo restaurant or is it a Coca-Cola restaurant? Or, there's a lot of business insights that they can deduce. In that case, that data, at least on your GPS, needs to be encrypted homomorphically because it's extremely sensitive. It's really intrusive. What happens is the person at Kroger in charge of data insights, and there's a whole department at Kroger, I believe it's called 8451, that is in charge of alternative data revenues. So in most large companies, there's the people that are deducing the business insights and then turning around and go like, wow, we're sitting on a gold mine, but how do we do this in the right way and not really take the data away from Eric? So it starts with kind of the marketing data analytics department, but then, protecting the data is really the responsibility of the CISO and the CDO and others. So you can have the marketing department set the rules, or you can have the CISO set those rules. And that will depending on the workflow. In that case that I've described, PepsiCo will only get data that your column, which means your geotagging data, will be obfuscated using homomorphic cryptography. And in that case, they will need to know certain coordinates and try to run, tell me if this coordinate matches this credit card. And that's the sort of analytics that they would run on it. I think it's pretty simple in that case. If the computation is much more intense, they will require on the PepsiCo side a little bit more computational capabilities. And that means they either deploy our API in multiple different, let's say, Kubernetes nodes, or they enhance the computation using accelerators such as chip accelerators.
Excellent. And so for on the PepsiCo side, and this I guess goes to how is the evolving needs of the workplace. What is the training of the people on the PepsiCo side who would be both, determining the algorithms, processing it in particular, and we'll stay with in the homomorphic state, just because that's a nuance that goes beyond just simple algorithmic management.
I wouldn't look from an administration perspective. It's pretty intuitive. But if you are running computations, and the more complex the computations run on encrypted data, no matter what's the underlying algorithm to encrypt that data, you will hit certain walls from, if the data was encrypted too much and the computation is non-linear, you might get what we call noise at the end of the end of the curve, right? And if you're using, for instance, differential privacy rather than homomorphic encryption, at least my opinion is it would be greater using simpler type of linear equations such as averages and those type of things, where homomorphic encryption will probably give you a better result as it relates to nonlinear type of computation. But if you're a data scientist, you need to understand on the PepsiCo side, what does that mean to run computation on encrypted data? First of all, you can't most data scientists love to just download plain text data and start looking at it. And they're like, what am I seeing here that's an anomaly? That's less available, obviously, by the fact that the data is obfuscated. And therefore, you need to kind of trust your system to really use the results more than understanding the inputs. So even if you're doing this on genome data, it's another good example, right? You're running a computation on genomic data, you'll get the right results, but you cannot really see what Eric's genome or what's his blood type and so forth. You can't connect the two. So yes, there is a more tax in learning and understanding the results of homomorphic cryptography and making sure that you're also only running computations that are efficient on that data, or else you will deal with other types of issues such as distortion and noise. So yeah, there is a little bit of education. Homomorphic encryption and those types of capabilities were really in academia for the past 10 years, and they're now popping up with a lot of different opportunities and different use cases. What's unique about our use case is that it's not a use case, meaning use it anywhere you want for whatever purpose you want. And that's why other companies, that you mentioned before, only pick one use case and do it well, because it's hard to understand, what are the different, why am I getting a different result when I'm running this algorithm versus I'm running another algorithm? And that really is going down into the math and understanding what are the capabilities of these privacy enhancing technologies and what are the results. So I would say there is an education, but the education is worth it if you want to share sensitive data and if you want to give full privacy to your client.
And just to sort of double click on this notion of the computational overload and the complexity of managing like a fully homomorphic environment versus a partially homomorphic, when you're talking to potential users, how are they? Do they immediately is there an understanding that like, oh, why can't I do fully homomorphic? Oh, it's way too intense. Is there an appreciation of how in some ways limiting fully homomorphic encryption is going to be, because even though it has, even though you can have a more complex computation, the computational overload associated with that means that, like, is it done yet? Is it done yet? Is it done yet? Like, so what are you seeing in terms of an appreciation of the trade-offs, how organizations are adapting to it? Yeah.
Generally, I don't think that there is enough knowledge on the subject, to be very honest. When I say the words homomorphic cryptography, many people look, and it looks like it's really hitting over their heads. Okay, so we're really at the beginnings of the understanding of those type of technologies and the ability to scale them. What I do get a lot is people listening to me saying the word homomorphic cryptography, then punching it up in Google, and the first article that comes up is an academic article that says that it doesn't scale. Right. So a lot of time, a lot of efforts have been put into, even Professor Kurt Rawl from New Jersey, who you've probably heard of around duality. He created.
Had him on the podcast.
Oh, really? He's fantastic and created an amazing library in the Palisades Crypto Library. I mean, it's a complex, very heavy type of library. So the people that did hear that, immediately there's the reaction around performance, meaning we get the first question that when we explain what we can do is around performance. So I think there's the people that do understand a little bit about homomorphic cryptography understand that it does two things. It increases the size of the data, and then of course it increases the computation and efforts and the resources that are needed to compute more complex operations on the data. That means, in my opinion, that you need to very selectively be able to use this technology. And this is where we believe that we've innovated in the ability to say, you could maybe choose one cell to homomorphically encrypt only because you're trying to get a chain of custody of who controls the data downstream, and you're not really trying to boil the ocean and run full homomorphic encryption computation and on data. But that said, the advancements in both the reduction of the size of the data, which we feel we've managed to get to a very, very small reduction. Usually, if you go out of the box, homomorphic encryption increases the size by 12,000. Okay, that's a lot. We managed to take it down to 3. And that's because we do a lot of optimization to the data before we actually encrypt the data. We figure out what's right to encrypt and what's not. Because if it's not an integer, if it's not something that's you could run calculations on, why encrypt that?
Right.
So you need to selectively choose the one, and that's why we allow our customers to really decide per the workflow. This is going to outside parties, do encrypt. This is going to internal, maybe not. That's really the, I believe, the innovation. And people need to be understanding that it comes with performance tax, but those performance taxes could be mitigated and you could achieve really the scalable solution that you're looking for data sharing using this technology.
Now, do you have components of secure multi-party computation associated with your solution, or is that?
You mentioned one of the issues is computational power on a homomorphically encrypted data. What we have done is we have a notion of something called a trust token. The trust token is an ERC20 token that gets awarded. It's privately minted by us and given to our clients to give to their customers. So if you take the Kroger and PepsiCo example, it's Kroger or PepsiCo that will provide a Kroger trust token to you for agreeing to share your geotagging data. That trust token has three utilities to it. One is the exchange of data and the authorization of the data. The second is as a currency in a closed loop to be able to exchange that token for other services and loyalty programs within that ecosystem. And third, to allow it to be paid as gas money for distributed computation from homomorphic encryption. So we've used our token as a way to mitigate potential performance barriers. So if you're a large corporation, you would run this and probably enhance it with FPGA and enhance it with a ton of different installation, parallelize the efforts to reduce any delay on the performance of computation on encrypted data. But what we're saying is in a decentralized world and in a world where even computation can be distributed, you could use that same trust token to reward, miners in this case, but in this case, it's not really miners, but it's processing power to process multi-party computation on encrypted data using a token as a reward, which we think is a very kind of innovative way to do it. And we've written a white paper about that. Wow.
That's there's a bit to unpack in that. That's pretty novel. Now, how would one, so what would be the primary reward system where you would accumulate enough of these gas tokens? And when we use gas tokens, everybody's thinking like, gas to do a transaction. We're not talking about public blockchain. We're talking about computational power.
Exactly.
Now, but presumably you'd have to, in order to do these computations or to get paid for these computations at any kind of scale that's meaningful, right? You would need to accumulate. What would be the basis for accumulating the volume sufficient to actually pay for that processing power?
It's a quite interesting. So we mint these ERC20 tokens. So let's say you were Kroger in this case, and I'm sorry that I'm picking on them because they're not really a client yet, but
they will be after this. No,
they will be after this, hopefully. But what happens is that we, let's say, mint 1 million tokens. Kroger takes it and it's called one token. Kroger calls it the Kroger one token, and then gives it to clients for you to share. You shared something with them. Those tokens could be exchanged for loyalty programs for the partners, or could be used as a currency to then exchange, maybe buy something on the metaverse using Kroger's, in the Kroger store using maybe Chase's credit card, right? And each one of those ecosystem members will be able to accept those one tokens, which are ubiquitous. And that's really where it connects to anyone on the gas side that is allowing you also to run computations on it. It will be getting Kroger one token or a JP Morgan one token. But these are still one tokens, which eventually, when the network effect gets created, you could use as a currency to either buy something at the local vendor that they bought, that provided to you, or use it for other digital service on the metaverse. So you, as the person that's doing a lot of computation on the homomorphic encryption here, are accumulating trust tokens from different vendors. They're really the same underlying technology, but you can then redeem them for services with those vendors.
Oh, Okay, or possibly sell them to others.
The problem with selling them to others is because
there's a securities law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The problem with selling them to others is we always say trust cannot be bought. But eventually, there will be a way to, once there's enough, let's say, vendors using these trust tokens, that you yourself can turn around and say, I've accumulated the same one tokens from 4 or 5 vendors, and I want to turn around and I want to use them somewhere else. And that's when the token becomes less branded and it becomes just your one token. And you can then use it for exchange, meaning as long as it's part of the brand, that trust that was established between you, the user of the brand, cannot be broken by you just reselling that trust that was given to you. So that's why it's used in a closed loop inside of the ecosystem of those brands to exchange for loyalty and services within those ecosystems. Once you've accumulated enough brands, we will allow you at a certain stage to debrand them and basically say, now there are Eric's 21 tokens and he could be used by other, maybe your hospital system, to remunerate for data. So it's quite an innovative way, but it's got steps in them because we are very careful to make sure these trust tokens are used for trust establishment and not just sent and sold to anyone else.
So I'm going to go a little further down the rabbit hole on this before I pull back out into some other topics, which is if for the processor, do you view the processor as having access to a significant amount of processing power, and that would be their willingness to engage in this way, or do you see it as being potentially even smaller, individualized use cases where components of a larger processing power? And I raise this like we had a Dietmar Thorsen from Poly, a cooperative, on the podcast. And basically, it's a cooperative where everybody's sort of contributing their data and their processing power, and they actually can get individually paid for doing processing on their mobile phone, which blew me away because that makes them care more about privacy if they're also, like, it was a way of sort of saying, pure privacy data, data management may not be enough to get you juiced, right? But if you're also processing, there's a little bit of money coming through. Anyway, the point being,
so my instinct and my vision is going towards that decentralized processing world. However, I'm also very realistic in terms of what capacity is there on a cell phone to run homomorphic encryption.
Yeah.
Okay. And so
I don't think they're running homomorphic encryption. They're running computation.
So there's the future utopian, as you said, several decades versus where we are right now. So right now we're looking for mostly institutional processing, but as it becomes more available and processing power becomes more available, yes, the intent is to distribute it down to individuals that will be able to make those trust tokens. The only problem that we have on that is connecting between who you are as a persona for the individual versus the trust tokens that you own. And that's what we call the brand and the sell, meaning it's a go-to-market strategy that believes that currently individuals have no power, and therefore they need the brand, meaning take 10,000 JP or 1 million JP Morgan trust tokens will be easier to distribute to 1 million people because they are clients of JP Morgan. Once you've done that, because it's a branded type of token, and by the way, that token is connected to a stable coin, and that's why you're able to, each different vendor is able to assume different rewards for that token, meaning I'll give you 10,000 Singapore Airlines miles for one token, or I'll give you 5 PepsiCo bottles for that token. All of that will be determined in a relationship to a stable coin. So there's an ability to create a price for that. But once you have enough of let's say, individuals that have this token, we intend of then opening another face for that token, which makes it the individual, not just the branded token. But now I've accumulated 10 tokens from PepsiCo, 10 tokens from Kroger. I can turn around and accumulate them together and say, this is me as a persona, and I'm using these trust tokens to now, transact in the Web 3.0 environment. And that's when the token, in our belief, will become more individual. But if I went immediately and said this is an individual token, then I have a long way to go to make sure that everybody accepts that token. And that's why we're starting from the corporation And after getting enough sizable clients that are using this token, turn around and open the individual capabilities to it.
Let's talk a bit about the encryption node. What's in your encryption node technically today?
So let's first of all explain why is there an encryption. We are an API. So anything that goes through the API can be wrapped with a digital rights wrapper that includes the digitized policy and the encryption level. And that gets done in real time, not, it's already encrypted and let me pull the encrypted data set. So you're sitting on potentially a non-encrypted database, and there's a proxy in between the applications, a one creation proxy in between the applications and the data lake. And every time an application says, I want to receive this data from the data lake, the proxy then sends it to our gatekeeper. We call it the orchestrator, but it's a gatekeeper where the smart contracts are. And the smart contracts have a reference to what's in the database through the metadata. Plus, they have rules that have been created by the creator. So the orchestrator says, oh, it's Eric looking to get data from this data lake. What is Eric allowed to do under the policies? Then go inside the database, create maybe a JSON object of only Eric's data payload, and then reach to this encryption node. That's when the encryption node gets activated, because it could be that this particular workflow demanded that Eric's data payload is completely encrypted. So it sends a message now. It knows what it needs to encrypt, which columns and which, maybe the whole set, let's assume the whole set will be encrypted homomorphically. It then uses this productionized version of Palisades Crypto. This is the library that we are using to do homomorphic encryption, same one as duality. And it decides what to encrypt. When it decides what to encrypt, it then uses out of the box a HashiCorp Vault key management system that creates basically key pairs for any attribute and the consumer of that attribute, right? And it could either take it from that key management, or it can connect to your, let's say, Azure key management or your AWS key management system. So what happens in the encryption is a very quick wrapping of that JSON file into the right appropriate encryption. And it happens really fast. We use Apache Flink as our transactional workflow, so it's really, really fast. But if, for instance, you require to encrypt a massive file, a terabyte or a petabyte, fully homomorphic encryption, which could be a lot of processing at that scale, then you can also multiply the instances or parallel the instances of the encryption node in order to handle that type of performance requirements. But that's really what happens in the encryption node in real time.
Excellent. And then maybe just taking a big step back, when you're going out to potential institutional adopters, in the US, your privacy regulation, those who care most about it, is unlike Europe, where it's like resident or person focused. It's sort of like for residents. In the US, it's more sectorized, right? It's health and financial information. That's where you see most of the regulation. When you're talking to potential institutional adopters, where do you see the most uptake for this kind of solution? Is it health? Is it financial services? Is it starting to come in from an area you wouldn't have expected?
So, two things to say about that. Number one is you need to find the visionary in the organization. The problem is with most organizations, the data is siloed. And the easy thing when you hear about our solution is to think about, how do I protect data I've already collected? But we really want organizations to start thinking about data in a less siloed way, in a more enterprise way. And therefore, it's mostly C-level chief digital officers in charge of business insights that are interested in changing the way that they're collecting and redistributing the data. The CISOs and the CDOs are interested in the governance and the enforcement of that data. So, on one hand, if you go to organizations in the United States, then the governance, risk, and compliance part is more interesting to them. But the real benefit of our solution is done with organizations like Kroger or something like that have been collecting a lot of data on customers and then want to share it and maybe create alternative revenues for them. So The interesting thing is that we sell to the personas, not the industries. And we then find that, yes, you're correct. We have an upcoming project with genome testing, very similar to like a 23andMe, right? And yes, the application there is tremendous because the user can then control that FBI doesn't share his data as 23andMe data. So the beachhead that we have established, just because of my context, is in the financial services. It's very quickly moving into healthcare. There are massive, massive use cases for this in healthcare. And really interesting, just last week, we were accepted into a program called Fuse for a very large legal company called Allen & Overy in the UK. It's one of the largest law firms. And they have an incubation program where they're looking to take this technology and move it to their clients, but really apply it to legal tech, right? Maybe the next generation data rooms, no need for data room using this technology because you can keep the data on your side and it's only your signature and it will expire, without your need to delete it. So we are thinking of where to apply this technology to come up with new use cases. Legal tech, retail, as I just mentioned, could be a very big area. But the low-hanging fruits when this, where people care about sovereignty and those type of issues from a governance, risk, and compliance are currently financial and health.
Excellent. So I've covered a bit. I've gone down a couple of rabbit holes. Before we break, have I missed a topic that in going down these rabbit holes that we didn't cover as you think might be interesting to my listeners?
Well, it's not that you've missed it. It's just that I'm trying to explain to people that privacy tsunami is coming. And the application, and it's coming both from a technological and Web 3.0 perspective and from a regulatory perspective. Yet it's really the responsibility of governments to start providing regulation that will move that sovereignty to the individual. I do believe that there is a huge opportunity for us to equalize, differentiate, differing polarization of wealth using data. And that organizations that act upon that democratization of their users' data will only be more successful rather than less successful. And this is not about who cares about privacy. It's about doing the right thing. And, a lot of people are fascinated about ESG investing now. Well, think about if you were an organization that treated your clients' data differently, provided clients a little skin in the game as it relates to that business insights that you're collecting, that G in the ESG will increase dramatically. You will be more investable, and it's the right thing to do. So I would hope that organizations are not just motivated by what the regulation says, but how do they beat the curve to providing a self-sovereign environment and therefore a very easy transition into the Web 3.0 type of environment. And I believe that that's really a high-level discussion that should be spoken at C-level type of executives.
Right. And I think on that point, you already see the backlash of companies that are perceived as not doing the right thing with data, specifically in the social media universe. You have Google, you have Apple, you have Facebook. I'm sure there's a couple others. Those are the big players. And you've seen each of those companies, like Apple in particular, take very significant steps to protect the data and the impact that has had on the way that other companies are perceived, like Meta, trying to figure out what the hell to do with Apple's, the way that Apple is managing privacy. Those kinds of changes occurring there. And Twitter, I mean, we don't have to go much further than Elon Musk buying Twitter. That gets more to censorship, but it also goes to, who owns the data, in a Web 2, universe. And so these issues about data sovereignty, they are coming to the fore. And I think what you're seeing in the social media universe is definitely going to have more of a trickle down, is going to start to move into other industries, because at that level, people do care. They care. They don't care at a specific individualized. I want to control all the policies that my data is subject to. Although the visualization is important, what they do care is this notion of, there's a company that's mismanaging my data. Like now they're like, that's a problem, right? Yeah, so if you build that trust early, you don't end up backpedaling like in many ways I think Meta has. And
I think that Meta needs to understand that the business model is changing. So if they are changing with this business model, which means the client is going to be, or the citizen is going to be at the center of those decisions and how you collect business insights, then they can actually benefit. Like, you mentioned something about Apple. The interesting thing is that the statistics is 96% of all people that downloaded 14.5 privacy capabilities on Apple iOS have blocked at least one app. And that's at all ages. That means that when the opportunity to control something was presented to them, they acted upon it. And that's why people say we don't care, because they've been conditioned to just pressing that blackmail, privacy policy. But we've been conditioned. We don't really see it as blackmail. We just condition because it's the way to actually use the service. I think those parameters and equations are changing. And Apple was the great shot across the bow. We believe that we're the software version of what Apple has created on the hardware device. So if you want to install and create what the Apple experience was for your clients, give them our software, and that will be the same experience. So yes, people start caring more when they have the rights to control. Those tools have never been provided to them.
Right. And at a simplistic level, you could even go back a little further to unsubscribe on emails, right? So you go back 5 years, who would have hit unsubscribe? Today, you look at your email sometimes, if it's not already being, managed, you see stuff that's coming through to your main, your main,
immediately.
You're like, okay, I'm going to manage this, and people get it. Like, I'm going into unsubscribe and I'm hitting unsubscribe because I don't want to be spammed with all this data. So people have adapted to it, and in many ways that is privacy, because it's forcing, it's not somebody taking your data and being used by the companies, but yet your data is being used to have those companies market you. And back to your point with your son, like, that was very targeted marketing. You certainly don't want them getting it to begin with, but from the consumer level, they clearly evidence, you and others evidence a desire to say, I don't want you to use my data, and I also don't want you to spam me with this information as well.
This ability to revoke will go into the notion of open banking, which will apply to any type of organization. What does open banking say? I can move my account information, like I can move my phone number between Verizon and Sprint, or any other company. Well, think about your policies and your privacy being able to be mobile. So if you're thinking only on the account level at open banking, think further, because eventually it will become, I need to move my whole data. Well, if you're able to then have a relationship with the user that is able to click, I revoke, and then all of his data is revoked on your side as the corporation, that's great, because you don't have the operational mess of maintaining and deleting that data. And the customer all of a sudden sucks all that data into his own vault and press stop, Bank of America, start Chase. And that's a much better way to have portability of your avatar, portability of who you are, not just your account information.
Excellent. So, well, great. It's been fantastic having you on the podcast. Thanks so much, Zohar. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. And I hope you have a good day and a happy Passover to the ones that it applies to.
Same. Take care.